Given the recent developments in Venezuela, how do you see the role of BRICS ahead? Recently, there was news that a Russian tanker was seized in the Atlantic. Moreover, Iran, one of the top suppliers of oil to China, is facing crisis. Oh yeah, they are facing a crisis. So what options do they have now? Could Russia now escalate the war in Ukraine? And can China now make a move on Taiwan? Or does it face the risk of being encircled? And how does this impact India and our neighborhood? And what cards do we have now? Okay, a lot happening. A lot happening. See, first of all, the US last year, just a couple of months ago, came up with this national security strategy, this new document, in which they have operationalized a 21st century version of the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine was an old US foreign policy from 1823, which said that the US will no longer allow any external non hemispheric power to interfere in the Americas, North America or South America. No European power, no other power will be allowed to interfere. Only the US will be allowed to be the sole hegemon and the global super cop in the Americas. That's the old 1823 Monroe Doctrine. Now there is a Trump corollary to that that's been added on top of it. It says that not only will external non-hemispheric powers not be allowed to operate and interfere in the Americas, but even local, regional actors such as governments that may not be aligned with the US objectives or US interests, or cartels or whatever, even those will not be allowed to operate, and the US will go after any of them. To hell with international law. And that's what the US is doing now. So the Americans have now, see, we know they did a regime change in Venezuela. They kidnapped, they abducted the president of Venezuela, Mr. Maduro, and his wife, who are now in prison in the US, awaiting some sort of trial. And the Americans have said that Venezuela will now operate as per American demands. All the oil that Venezuela sells will be sold through the United States. So it's like the good old East India Company situation. Whatever India exported while under British occupation was exported to Britain or through Britain, and all the profits were taken by the British, with a little bit trickling back to India just to kind of stay semi-conscious, that sort of thing. So that's the East India Company colonial policy, which is exactly what the US is now operationalizing in Venezuela. And to make this happen, if you want to ensure, if you are the United States and you want to make sure that Venezuela's oil only passes through American channels and American hands, whether it's sold to the US or to third parties, it has to be sold through the US. That's how the US controls everything. Now, if you have tankers, oil tankers, or other vessels that are carrying the flags of other nations, like Russia, for example, or China, or whatever, and they come to Venezuela and take oil, the Americans will not allow that. If this happens, then the American Monroe Doctrine and Trump corollary goes for a toss, and it loses credibility. So that's why the US has gone ahead and seized this Russian tanker. I think it was not carrying any oil. Was it carrying something else? We don't know. It's not been declared. But the Americans went ahead and boarded the vessel and captured the vessel and its crew. There's a couple of Indians on board. There's a bunch of Ukrainian citizens and a couple of Russian citizens also, maybe. That sort of situation is there right now. So what's the status of the crew, the vessel? It's a work in process right now. We don't quite know exactly what the situation is, right? So the last we know is that the Americans boarded and captured the vessel and its crew. Now you say rightfully that Iran is facing a crisis. There's tremendous demonstrations and whatnot in Iran. The people, I suppose, have been fed up of the Islamic regime in Iran. I think that's an organic sentiment that comes up from the ground level. It's not astroturfed. It's not manufactured. I'm sure there'll be some Iranians who will be aligned with the Islamic regime, but I think it's pretty clear that the majority of the people aren't aligned with the Islamic regime in Iran, and they seek a change, and that makes Iran fertile ground for a US regime change operation or US-led regime change operation. And it dovetails perfectly with US interests in the region, right? So if the Americans take Persia, take Iran, okay, they effect a regime change and bring back the son of the Shah or whatever, yeah, then you will have Iran, this big, powerful nation in West Asia, just west of the subcontinent. It will now become a US asset. It will become operationalized as a US asset, right? And if that happens, then the Americans control essentially most of the oil supply, energy supply in the world. Venezuela, 20% of oil reserves. Okay. we know that the Venezuelan oil is special oil. It's heavy oil. It's sour oil. There's only 3 or 4 refineries in the world that can process that, including one in India, right? But still, it's 20% of the world's oil reserves, proven oil reserves. Now, if you take Iran, the Americans already control Iraq. They control the UAE. They, you could say, control Saudi Arabia to a large extent, right? The Saudis can't do much against the US. Then, if they control Iran as well, then that becomes a huge problem for a nation like China, which then becomes very dependent on Russia. Because even other nations like Angola, Nigeria, whatsoever, all these nations are also aligned with the US. So if the Americans take Iran, then they can essentially clamp down on China's energy supply on demand and make China completely dependent on Russia. Right? So, and we are also seeing other movements in the region. For example, Somaliland is being recognized now. It's been recognized by Israel. The UAE has also de facto recognized Somaliland. So that becomes a piece of the puzzle that the Americans can now put in their kitty, because they can now start dominating the Gulf of Aden, the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb region. They can choke off all the goods, supplies, etc. that move into China. We Indians talk about blockading Malacca. The Americans will blockade Bab el-Mandeb and Hormuz. Why blockade Malacca? The Americans think 20 steps ahead. So the Americans are essentially putting the pieces, aligning the pieces in the geopolitical chessboard such that they can choke China. Start the process of being in a position to choke off China on demand, if whenever required, right? And could Russia now escalate the war in Ukraine? Well, I suppose they could. They are in a position to do that. They have the resources, the military capabilities, etc. And there is some escalation of the war in Ukraine. The Russians just a few hours ago launched a series of missile strikes in western Ukraine. They took out a big gas reservoir which supplies Ukraine with energy in winter. Winter is here, and Ukraine is going to lose that energy, right? So the Russians used Oreshnik IRBMs, intermediate range ballistic missiles, to strike at this gas reservoir or plant or whatever it was. And the Oreshniks, apparently the warheads did not contain any explosive charges, but they were sufficient to devastate the thing, the oil reserve, the gas depot. That's what it looks like. It's still to be ascertained and verified, right? So that's the situation right now. Could Russia escalate the war in Ukraine? Possibly so. The Americans are also bringing in legislation that could target Russia with 500% tariffs and impose secondary tariffs on nations like India, Brazil, etc., China, 500% tariffs on us. Yeah. So that will further and the objective is to devastate the Russian economy and to prevent other nations from purchasing Russian oil, which is one of the major things that the Russian economy depends on, right? So the Americans are acting. See, there are nations that talk, there are nations that act. The Americans act. Okay? Can China now make a move on Taiwan? Well, I suppose they can. But the Americans will turn Taiwan into China's Ukraine. Right? It will start bleeding the Chinese economy. You see? You see who's the most powerful nation in the world? I've been saying this for the longest time. China is not a superpower, not even close to being a superpower. The only nation close to being a superpower is Russia. Let me put something on the screen. This is my power index of the most powerful nations. This was calculated last year. I will recalculate it for this year. I mean, this was for 2024. Not much has changed. So the most powerful nation in the world is the USA with a hard power score of 93. Next is Russia with a hard power score of 54. Russia at least fights. China doesn't fight. It hides behind other nations. China hides behind Russia. China doesn't dare fight the US. The Russians fight. The Russians dare to fight. You can see the difference between China and Russia. So here we have Russia at number 2. The American hard power score is 93. Russia's hard power score is 54. China has a hard power score of 15. And India has 4.9. These are the four nations that matter. Israel has a hard power score of 0.62, but actually, this is just a raw hard power score. Actually, Israel is one of the five sovereign nations in the world. Only five sovereign nations in the world exist. I'm going to have to recalculate the stuff for the year 2026. Okay. Yeah, so Israel actually should have a sovereignty score of over 1. So that's the situation. Now, how does this impact India? It's going to impact India in a variety of ways. If the Americans bring in their legislation to impose 500% secondary tariffs on India, that's going to devastate the India-US trade relationship. Yeah, $120 billion or so. It's the trade relationship that will devastate any prospect of Indian exports going to the US. Right? It's going to be a big setback for the Indian economy. I wonder what it does to the Indian IT sector. I'm not sure we've looked into that. And it's gonna be a huge leverage that the US has over India to align India forcibly, arm twist India into forcibly aligning with American policies, objectives, and interests. Essentially, the US seeks to vassalize India. If that happens, if that succeeds, well, then it's back to the good old East India Company days for India, right? So it affects our neighborhood also.